Good evening, everyone. Welcome, a very warm welcome to the Stanford family for this very special event with our own Naushad Forbes. I'm Paula Mariwala from Mumbai, and I have Hari Sesishai also from Mumbai. And, we're delighted to start this evening off for a thought-provoking discussion on a lovely book by Naushad, Struggle and Promise, Restoring India's Potential. We had the pleasure of hosting Naushad in person in Mumbai last month, and the energizing response and feedback that we got led us to plan this virtual event for the larger pan-India Stanford community. So in these polarizing times, when we are getting bombarded by extreme views on either side of the spectrum, we really need to find gray between all the black and whites that we have. In our own country, we are told that we are a country with the greatest potential, with phenomenal growth, yet we are dropping on all human indices. So there are those who believe that with our past glory and our immense growth, we are the shining stars, and those who feel we have absolutely no future and the future is all dark. And this seems to be the trend globally. So in this backdrop, the title of Naushad's book itself indicates the struggle and promise itself suggests how relevant it is to look at both challenges and opportunities in today's complex world and look at it with a lens which is not colored by prejudice. And there is much talk about a lot of this as Naushad touches upon many relevant topics in this book, which I'm sure will spark off an interesting dialogue with all of us today. So without further ado, let's get started. Naushad, of course, needs no introduction to the Stanford community, but he brings a unique blend of being an academic, an industrialist, and a leading intellectual. So I'm going to start with the academic Naushad first. Being a Stanford alum, that's what appeals to me the most. And I'm going to introduce him by reading from his own book in his own words, about the academic Naushad. So Naushad writes in one of the chapters in his books, and I quote, "I loved college. I went to Stanford when I was 18 and left with a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering and history and a master's and PhD in industrial engineering. By the time I got my last degree, I'd been in the Department of Industrial Engineering longer than half of the faculty and all of the furniture. If those who get doctorates are supposed to be highly focused, I was briefly a major in civil engineering, mechanical engineering, English, and returning from a wonderful term at Stanford's campus in the UK, even British studies. And I did not leave the university when I graduated. I taught a course roughly once a year at Stanford for another 17 years. So that is our alum Naushad. But of course, Naushad is a well-known industrialist, co-chairman of Forbes Marshall's, India's leading steam engineering and instrumentation firm, also chairman of Ananta Aspen Center, and he has long been an active member of the CII and was president of CII for 2016-17, where he got a deep insight not into the Indian industrial sector, but also into the policy-making minds of the government. He's written widely on innovation and developing countries and in higher education in India, including a book From Followers to Leaders, and he writes a monthly column in the Business Standard. Along with me, I have Hari Sesishai, who is also from Bombay, who is going to anchor this with me, and he's going to do the heavy lifting and ask the more difficult questions. But I'm going to start off by asking Naushad about Stanford. Clearly, Stanford has played a huge role in shaping you, Naushad. So if you look back and see what Stanford was then and what it is today, and if you look at the world today, especially in the post-pandemic era, do you see that traditional higher education needs to change? Stanford is, of course, one of the younger institutions at 130 odd years, 150 now. And, there are institutions out there who've been around for so many more. Is it time to change for is it time for a change for higher education with all the new technologies and new trends? And then can India play a catch-up game as maybe all institutions are back at the starting line and we can all approach this together without an undue advantage of history? And how can we in India innovate then to catch up with what we may have missed in this journey so far in higher ed?
So, good evening, everyone, and Paula, thank you very much for that introduction. You know, Stanford has played a really huge role in my life, and it's played a really huge role in the lives of all of us in our family, actually. My brother Farad, who's also on the VC, also has 3 degrees from Stanford. My niece has three degrees from Stanford. My nephew, we keep teasing, has only 1. You know, you know, it's played a big part in our family, and we deeply believe that Stanford has played a big role in making us who we are today. So your question on, you know, does a university like Stanford, you know, does it still carry the weight it does post-pandemic? Does it need to change? What can we learn from Stanford as model? You know, there's a chapter on higher education that you read from in the introduction from just now, and clearly in that chapter, what comes across is that Stanford is my reference point. When I think about higher education, I think about how we in the world should try to approach higher education, how we should approach it in India. In the back of my head, I have Stanford and my Stanford experience as a student and as teacher, you know, really there. So what would change, I think? You know, without question, if there's one thing that we've learned in the pandemic, it's that we can interact one with the other as we're doing just now, virtually. And as a result, I think what's definitely going to change is the role that great universities play in large lecture courses. I think that role is going to become not a lesser role, but it's going to become a much less proprietary role. In other words, you won't go to Stanford to take a large lecture course, it seems to me, in the future from a set of great professors. Instead, you would probably over time get access to great professors in many universities worldwide. And you could sort of mix it up from a large lecture class perspective. But the role of seminars, the role of small, intense discussion, the ability to have a conversation with someone who has maybe even a Nobel Prize in a small session, the ability to deal with incredibly bright fellow students, that, it seems to me, I think a world without that happening physically will be a much poorer world. And I would for myself, I mean, I would not want my education and the education of anyone that I really care about being an entirely virtual education. I think you'd lose a huge amount. And what you would lose is, I think, what we've seen during the pandemic. What you would lose is are those informal small conversations that build relationships. You'd lose the intimacy that comes from a physical event, as we experienced in the Bombay program that we had.
Yeah, absolutely.
You miss the standing and chatting with those you're standing in line with to fill your plate. The conversations after and before. I mean, those are all things that I think physical contact is so important for, and I hope it will always be an integral part of great higher education. So having said that, what should we do in India? I mean, Paula, you're involved in some of the great experiments that are now taking place in India to build, big privately funded great universities. And it seems to me that we should build off this availability of great lectures so that, you can have great lectures, and we should figure out how we can work out deals with different great universities and sort of say we want to be able to access these from different faculty, different places around the world. But then I think we need to really recruit the best talent we possibly can of all nationalities, so that we can expose our own wider population and give them access and more access to that great small group intense interaction that helps form minds. So I'm giving you a very traditional definition of education, of higher education. I'm not there's a good reason why I'm not big on highly digital forms of education. It's because I don't particularly understand them. Not because I don't think they have great power. They do have great power without question. But I think someone else should on this call. I'm sure there are many people who would be able to talk to that much better than I can, because they understand digital technologies much better than I can. Manu understands them much better than I do, certainly. But my model of higher education is still Stanford, but I think it's going to change in that way. I think less large lectures, but small group interaction with fellow students. All of that is going to be just as important as it always was.
Great. Thanks, Naushad. Hari, I'm going to turn it over to you to take on some of the other parts of his book.
Okay, thanks, Paula. Well, before actually going into the book, just one thing. I see a couple of people have come in with just letters being put on their names. If you don't mind, please do change that to your name whenever you can. And in any case, so before getting into any questions, I wanted to just say a little bit about the book. I feel, as Paula also said, it's very rare that you find someone with Naushad's background who does not only include theoretical academic aspects, but also connects those theories and those ideas to practical things on the ground. How exactly do we implement these ideas? So I found that extremely useful. And I would have thought that most practitioners in this country who work in government, who work in institutions, Naushad also talks a lot about institutions in his book. I thought they would also be able to draw from this book and try to, implement some of these ideas. And in any case, one of the things that he says, I have a quote here that I wanted to highlight. Is that nowhere in the world, not even in the Soviet Union, is the gap between what might have been achieved and what has been achieved as great as it is in India. So that speaks, at least in my view, more about potential and the scope of what can be achieved and how much is left for people in this country to do, right? And he very smartly views these not from your typical, government viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of leadership in three specific spheres, which is economy, institutions, and culture. Because at the end of the day, you have to look at how you can shape your own economy by using and taking advantage of the institutions that exist, bettering them, and also taking advantage of the culture that exists in the country, right? And it's not just a really serious scholarly book. He also has a lot of quotes and a lot of comic strips. There's a quote by Snoopy as well, which I remember Naushad speaking about at the in-person event, that there are a lot of smart people in this world, but most of them are asymptomatic. Yeah. So I would highly, highly recommend the book. Okay, so let's move in, Naushad, to the first question. one of the things that you've written about is the importance of openness to trade. You spoke about it very early on, and you bring it up again towards the end. Um, and there was one particular thing that you wrote where there was a poll taken at a CII meeting where about 57% of companies, uh, as part of the poll, felt that it was a mistake to drop out of RCEP, the trade deal, right? And very few actually supported the government's position to withdraw from RCEP. So recently, though, a lot of this has changed. Yeah. The sort of narrative that you heard about free trade agreements, uh, let's say from 2014 onwards till last year, was that there was always a reluctance to them. And, why would we really go ahead with this if this benefits another country more than it benefits India? That was a question that was repeatedly asked by people in government and outside. Um, but now you have FTAs with the UAE, with Australia, and the US recently announced this IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also with the war in Ukraine, you have a lot of sort of global changes. So my question is, how do you see this impacting India, and do you really think there has been a sort of U-turn with regards to the openness to trade? Is this government being more open now than they were, over the past 8 years or so?
Thanks, Hari. Quick comment on that quote first. That quote is from an Economist survey of India from 1991.
Okay.
And it's the nowhere in the world is the gap between what has been achieved and might have been achieved as great as it is in India. And one of the comments that I make is that, well, it was great that you could make that statement very accurately in 1991. Within about 10 years, you couldn't make that statement. Because things started to change and move on for us as a country. And I hope we never get to the point again in our history where one would be able to make that statement. And have it ring true. The question on trade, as I say in the book, from 1991 to about 2016-17, the Indian economy was increasingly open. Trade barriers kept coming down, tariff rates just kept coming down, more and more sectors were opened to investment and to trade, to free trade. Since 2016-17, there's been a very significant reversal on trade front. And we've seen increases in tariffs now covering over 3,000 tariff lines. Over half the items that we import now carry higher tariffs on them than they did in 2016. So it's been quite a significant reversal. Also with that is exactly as you mentioned, since 2014, there's been this view that free trade agreements have not helped India, that they've actively indeed harmed Indian industry and so on. I don't believe that. I think they've not had the effect that they was expected to. They haven't harmed India. They haven't really helped India either. But for various reasons, I'll let people read the chapter in the book to get that. But in the last year, things have started to turn around again. So I'd say from 2014 to 2021, we were sort of as a country anti-free trade agreements, sort of like the US was, under Trump, anti-free trade agreements, and the US continues to be, by the way. So Biden, I think his own instincts, he was one of the people who was behind the at that time Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump took the US out of his first day in office, right? And Biden, I think, would like to be engaging with the world and from a free trade perspective again, but I don't think feels that he can risk it. So this Indo-Pacific economic framework is a vaguer concept. It's meant to be an alternative to the successor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think is called the CPTPP or something.
Yeah.
Free trade agreements all love horrible acronyms. So the CPTPP, it's meant to be an alternative even to RCEP. I think it will end up, if anything comes of it, it will end up being a quasi free trade agreement in a different name. If I had to predict something. And I think we've seen a big change in our domestic circles in how we see free trade agreements. So any free trade agreement that involves China, we're saying no, 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 no. But any other free trade agreement we seem to be keen on. So for example, as you mentioned, we've signed a free trade agreement a few months ago with the UAE. We signed one with Australia last month. We're in the process of signing agreements with Canada, working on one with the UK,
as well,
and now starting to actively negotiate with the EU. That'll be a huge one and probably the greatest potential for us as a country, because it gives us access to this massive market, the largest market in the world, which is the EU. So it's a welcome change that we're starting to see now in this last year. That change has not yet translated into tariffs coming down. So there haven't been reductions in tariffs until the last month. And it's quite interesting that as we've seen supply chain issues get thrown up as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, as these issues have become much more common and as inflation has been hit in the country, we've actually seen the government start to reduce tariffs on some items, permit the import of some items, including some food products. Then, of course, they've also gone the other extreme and they've started banning exports
as well,
of wheat and bringing in limits on sugar and so on, which to me makes no sense, because that runs contrary to our policy. If you're saying that, listen, you're serious about actually doubling farmer income, one of the way in which you increase farmer incomes is by letting prices rise and letting farmers earn more as a result from what they're growing, even if that means that local consumers then need to pay more for the particular item. And you can find other ways of dealing with that access to foodstuffs. So I think we've moved on in a positive direction in the last year in terms of our stance towards free trade agreements. I hope it will start showing now also in terms of tariffs, because a tax on imports should be seen as it is a tax on exports also. It's equal. And I hope that over time we'll get rid of this hang up that we can't be part of any free trade agreement that includes China. And maybe even re-engage with ourselves.
Yeah, no, I agree, Naushad, about specifically the China comment. We shouldn't let that, stop other opportunities from impacting the country. In any case, so connected to this free trade agreement.
Can I add another comment? You specialize in Latin America, right?
Yeah.
One of the biggest potential areas, it seems to me, is for trade between India and Latin America. I mean, what little experience we have as a company of Latin America is that the market is really attractive for Indian companies. The thing that keeps us from actually engaging with Latin America is distance, because of connectivity issues and so on, which I know you've written about.
And so, actually, Naushad,
potential area, you should keep pushing it.
But actually, now that you mention it, one thing that you have stated in the book is how, less intrusion from the government has always, and sort of lead from the private sector is something that's required. And that's actually what has happened with Latin America. So there are some things that people don't even know about. To give you an example, India's exports to Brazil are more than exports to Canada. They are more than exports to Russia. So it's already, a lot of business is already happening because the government has not taken a lead role with that region. So I think that is also an example of how your argument is actually correct when you look at India's trade with this region. So, moving from trade, I wanted to look at domestic manufacturing in India. And you've written about how the model that South Korea has of chaebols, where you have a few really big companies like Samsung, LG, Daewoo, Hyundai. You had said that that is not something that would work, the best for us. Something that could work better is what Germany has, which is thousands of the Mittelstand companies. So you're essentially like what we call SMEs, right? But still, even now, we are not getting manufacturing at the kind of numbers that Foxconn and even Vietnam has, where they employ 400,000 people, 100,000 people in one place. We still don't have that. And the only things I have seen that push this is skill development initiatives. You even have a ministry that works specifically on that. So what do you think we need to do? What do you think India needs to do, not just the government, right? To scale up these sort of from low productivity to higher productivity jobs?
So, one of our biggest missed opportunities is labor intensive manufacturing. You don't need to look far to see how beneficial it can be. We just need to look across our biggest land border is with Bangladesh. We go right around them. And Bangladesh has an incredibly successful garment industry, which provides 40% of its industrial value added. It employs, I believe, over 4 million people in that one single industry. And out of the 4 million people, I think, again, well over half, I think 2/3 or something are women. So as a result, Bangladesh has a much higher female labor force participation ratio than India does as a country, which then has all kinds of great social benefits that flows through the economy. So there are all these benefits, right? And the question is, well, if Bangladesh can do it, why can't Orissa, Assam, West Bengal, all the states that border Bangladesh, are very near to it. Andhra Pradesh, not very far away, why can't these states have the same kind of thriving garment industry that puts millions of people to work? And the opportunity still exists because the garment industry is moving out of China as China's wages rise. But it's moving to Bangladesh, it's moving to Vietnam, it's moving to some extent to Ethiopia. It's not moving to India. Yeah? And that still has the potential to put millions of people to work. So what would change? Well, we do need to change labor laws without a question. And the government has taken the first step in that direction. In September 2020, we took 44 labor laws, and simplified them, and more than anything else, removed duplication of them and turned them into 4 laws. And those laws are still to be completely notified by the union government. I'm not sure why it's taking so long, because it's now getting on for 2 years since the laws were passed. And then they need to be notified by all the state governments, because it actually tries to bring about a degree of flexibility and a degree of protection for most parts of labor, not just the formal labor that constitutes just 15% of the labor force in the country. So it's a sensible step. It's a step. It's not everything that we need to do. It's a step in the right direction. It's a sensible step. It needs to move further and faster. But the question I would ask is that even if we had the freest labor laws in the world, would Indian industrialists suddenly become huge labor-intensive manufacturing creators? Would we be seeing, a large garment company in garment factory in Bangladesh employs 30 to 50,000 people. A large garment factory in India employs 3 to 5,000 people.
3 to 5, yeah.
It's a 1:10 difference. Yeah, Li and Fung The Hong Kong-based company employs in China, in its factories, it employs over 1 million people. Foxconn employs, the Taiwanese company employs over 1 million people in China. We need these huge factories in India. Will we see Indian industrialists start investing in them? I don't think so, because I think Indian industrialists are still quite labor averse. I think decades of labor legislation have led all of us in industry to basically see much more labor being employed as a problem as opposed to being an opportunity. So we'll need to change that mindset. Now, how will we change that mindset? So I have a proposal. It's not in the book, but I have a proposal. My proposal would be, our prime minister, our current prime minister, one of the things that he likes to do, and he does extremely well, is he likes to be the number one salesman for the country. Sort of going around the world, interacting with businessmen, saying, come to India, etc. And I think he should get Li and Fung and Foxconn as two obvious companies to say, listen, what would it take for you to set up factories in India that employ 100,000 people, right? As your first step. What would it take? And then he should do a second thing. He should get Mukesh Ambani and he should get Gautam Adani to set up a labor-intensive garment factory in India, a large one. If you ask them, they won't say no. Let's use the closeness that they have with him to do something that's really productive in terms of establishing some good labor-intensive garment factories in the country. And if they set it up, I'll bet that you need a few of these examples that I think will then start to seed a whole bunch of other industrialists seeing it as attractive to actually invest in labor-intensive manufacturing. Otherwise, it's going to take 10, 20 years of better labor legislation before it starts showing up on the ground.
Okay, I think that would really be quite something if he actually does follow through on that. But I think you have a point on how much of an impact it would have when you have such big employers. It would also create more competition and more incentives for companies to mimic that and see if it can have some success. So Naushad, I wanted to move to cover a few other things that you've written about, since the book is quite diverse in the content that it covers, right? So one thing that struck me is that throughout the book, you have talked about how India is viewed as I think the word you've used is as a benign force. That people like us and they want us to succeed. And there's one quote here: we were told again and again how welcome Indian industry is as suppliers and as investors. So, globally, there has been quite a big change over the past few years post-COVID, where there's been a lot of sort of anti-China sentiment. And even now with the war in Ukraine, the West also has been quite critical of India not speaking out against Russia. So one, is this, and also there have been some questions, of course, about things like academic freedom, media freedom within India, human rights issues and stuff. So is this statement still as true as it was a few years ago when you began writing the book? And the other thing is, how do we leverage this soft power? Because I would think that India being a benign force is a big soft power advantage for us. So how do we leverage this? Not just government, but as businesses, as academics, as institutions.
So, our soft power is a huge advantage that we have. And our soft power comes from us being seen as this benign force in the world. And it also comes from us being seen as inclusive, as a country that offers something for everyone. That you will find food that you like in India. You will find dress that you like in India. You will find surroundings that you like in India, regardless of what your own background is and which country you come from. So we have in that sense something for everyone. Now, has this changed in the last 2 years? Well, I think there are some things pulling in different directions. So, for example, if you ask me, has it changed in terms of we seem to be less tolerant as a country in terms of social cohesion. Where and the more majoritarian the statements coming out from our leaders, we put that attractiveness of us as a soft power at risk. So we've definitely seen that in the last 2.5, 3 years. Second, there's something to balance that out, though, which is the rest of the world, and in particular China, has not helped its own cause. I mean, if you look at how China has handled the pandemic, I mean, they had an unbelievable opportunity to build trust and to become the leader of the world that they aspire to be. And they've completely blown that opportunity in terms of how they have worked. And by blowing that opportunity as comprehensively as they've done, and they now seem to be doing to their economy, they are creating again an opportunity for us in India. So you're right that we've come in for some criticism for our abstentions in the United Nations, for example, on the Russia-Ukraine war. We've abstained, 14 times on 14 different resolutions or something like that, or 11, I can't remember. But the message in Washington, at least in Washington, it's a little different in Europe, but the message in Washington is that the US administration, this is not the same as Congress, the US administration understands India's position. It understands and appreciates India's position, and it's actually working with the government in Delhi to help us diversify our arms imports from Russia so that we can stop being as dependent on Russia as a source of arms as we have been, which is our big compelling reason to not, criticize Russia and vote against them. They're helping in terms of integrating India into global supply chains for more critical goods. And if you looked at the Quad and the statements coming out of the heads of government meeting in Tokyo just in this last week, the messaging is very powerful that India is being actually sought as a country to, and I think no one's saying become an ally of the US. I don't think there's any pressure actually to do that. You will have, you have statements in Congress on that, but not from the administration, where they're saying, let's be friends. We all have a common interest in ensuring that that we build an Indo-Pacific framework that's more open, that involves free trade, that respects borders, that's more rules-based, and so on. And the more we can do there, the better for us all. So I think actually we have a big opportunity now, probably a bigger opportunity today than we had 3 years ago. In spite of the concerns over social cohesion, unfortunately, it shouldn't be that way, but unfortunately, the world's industry doesn't care enough about those kinds of issues. It cares about, otherwise they wouldn't have been such large investors in China all this time.
Naushad, I think someone has raised their hand. Then there's no name there, but I think Paula, if you're okay, we can open it up, or
yes,
I think you may
absolutely.
have a question as well, right?
No, let's take the question from, if C can introduce himself or herself.
And unmute too.
And unmute.
I've just put the request to ask to unmute. Okay,
maybe meanwhile I will ask.
You can go to D.
Is a D asking or?
You go to Neeraj.
It says 2 participants have raised hands. Sure. Whoever does have a question, please go ahead.
I can ask. While
Go ahead,
figures out
Neeraj. Sure.
the unmute. So Naushad and Paula, if you don't mind, you may want to pause recording because I may ask an inappropriate question.
No, don't worry. Don't worry.
We decided it's a small, close group and we will trust each other.
Yeah.
So Naushad, what did you want to write about that you did not write about?
I love Neeraj's questions always.
So let me tell you what I did actually with the book, and it'll sort of answer your question in a way. But then I'll come to that very specifically as an answer. So the subtitle of the book is, as Paula mentioned, Restoring India's Potential. Yeah, that wasn't always the subtitle of the book. The full book was, I started writing essentially in April 2020. I said, it's a great opportunity if I'm not going to be traveling at all to try and write. So and the book was pretty well done by early March 2021. And that was just about the time that, at least in Pune and Maharashtra, we were seeing a rise in the number of Delta infections. And I looked around at what was happening and I was really bothered. And then I said, as April came along, so I held off sending off the draft. And as April came along and I looked at how we were handling the Delta wave in India, the second wave in India, and I said, I can't write a book about Indian leadership without dealing with how badly we've handled the Delta wave. And so I went through and actually, I waited till early June, and then I went through the book again and rewrote bits of it to reflect how we handled the second wave, because I think we did a really terrible job. If we had an opportunity to save literally, I think, millions of lives, which we blew because of mishandling. And that's where, by the way, the subtitle then came from, because I said we need to restore our potential before we can, talk about achieving it. What did I then consciously leave out of the book? Well, I went through the book again before it finally went off to print. And I tried to take out things that would be sort of very objectionable to, let's say, people who wouldn't normally agree with me. Because, I didn't see the point, and I try to do this in my articles too, I didn't see the point in writing for people who agree with me. I think we have too much in the world of, Paula used in her introductory comments, she talked about polarization. And I'm a complete believer in what Paula said, that I think as a world, we suffer when we talk to only people who think like us and want to listen to people who only think like us. So I consciously sometimes censor myself. But I do it for that reason, because I want people who do not think like me to read, to hopefully read what I write. And I consciously subscribe. I've mentioned this in our program in Bombay. I consciously subscribe to a newspaper. It's an online newspaper that I do not like, and whose articles irritate me each time I read them. But I consciously subscribe to it because I say, listen, if this is what I'm saying, then I better practice what I preach, and I better read some of this.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
It does, but partly. In fact, the follow-on question would actually be based on what you're hearing from, or the questions you're getting on the book and related to the book. Which is the next book you're going to write?
I don't know. Someone suggested, someone who read the book, a friend of mine in Chennai, who read the book said, he says, I had no idea that you had these interests in culture, etc., etc. The second last chapter of the book and so on. He says that your next book should be focused around that. And it would be a lot of fun to actually write a book entirely on institutions, culture, politics. Probably more dangerous, but it would be a lot of fun. And I don't know if that'll be the next book. But I mean, who knows? But I think it's important to say what you believe, but to say it in a way that isn't going to be objectionable to the other side.
That's right. So does anyone else have any questions? Please feel free and
I think C, please unmute yourself.
I think C did it accidentally.
Yeah, I thought so too. Because we're quite a small Stanford alumni group. So,
So Hari, I have one question for Farhad, but I'll only ask if no one else has any other questions. So I'm just prepping Farhad for.
Sure.
I'm going to ping Naushad a little bit more on what he spoke about.
Sure.
In
So I have a question for Naushad.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So Naushad, my question to you is: you talked about majoritarianism in the country on the rise. So what would be your solution for implementing democracy without it being majoritarianism?
So, sure. So I mean, it's a very good question, right? Which is that at the end of the day, democratic rule is the rule of the majority, right? But how do you deal with that? You deal with that in two ways. You deal with that first in ensuring that you protect minority rights, because minorities tend to feel more vulnerable. So you consciously try to protect minority rights. And you ensure, and I'm not saying special rights, but I am saying that you want to provide rights which are where individuals feel completely secure, welcome, and equal with the majority. And all those words are important, it seems to me. They must feel welcome, they must feel secure, and they must feel equal with the majority. So that's the way in which even a majority deciding who the government is can still ensure that minorities, and the minorities can be, obviously religious minorities, but they can also be other minorities. They can be diversity comes in many flavors. It's not only religious diversity that we have in the country. We have huge diversity in how we look, how tall we are, what color we are. There's a north-south color scheme that changes. We have huge diversity in food. We have diversity in dress. And all of this is something that we need to, it seems to me, encourage and treasure. The second point I'd make about majoritarianism, I think the particular majoritarianism that we're talking about is where it seems very politically, to me, dangerous, because one is trying to not only appeal to majoritarian instincts, one is trying to sort of fan the flames of majoritarian instincts as a way of building support in one's vote bank. And that to me is very dangerous, because that could potentially threaten the long run social cohesion of the country. And I don't know if anyone will be able to really deal with that if it really bursts at some point. I hope it doesn't. I feel that a lot of it is, I think a lot of it is following one's own political instincts, but I worry about it. Now, how do you deal with it? I think you deal with it by focusing on things that unify. What are the things that unify? I think, economic prospects more than anything else. And if you say, listen, going after rapid economic growth, more jobs for all, better education for all, these are things that then run across society, and these are things that can unify. And I think putting one's energy and effort into those things that unify is much more positive and powerful.
Thanks, Naushad. I think Arvind had a question. Arvind Killan. Please, Arvind, go ahead.
Okay. So I have one observation, Naushad, and then there's really a substantive question behind that. Nana and I just returned from a walk from the what's called the Portuguese Camino from Portugal to Spain. And it was just fantastic. But one of the things that really amazed both of us was the large, very large number of Pakistani and Bangladeshi businesses run by very recent immigrants, small, medium-sized businesses in those countries. And so that leads me to my question, ironically coming from sitting in San Francisco this minute, but why is the international business outlook of India so very North American centric? I think I was surprised to hear Hari say that, our trade with Brazil is bigger than our trade with Canada.
Exports to Brazil, yeah.
Well, I meant to say exports. That's what I wrote exports down, but I said the trade. But yeah, so exports. So the question is, why is our soft power so geographically limited and our fascination with North America so large? Meanwhile, China is just walking right over Africa as if we didn't exist. So I'm really all ears to your inputs.
No, I mean, I think you're right on track, Arvind, with your view. I think it's a huge opportunity to look at the rest of the world and look at the world as a world. We have this huge footprint, for example, in the Middle East. The rupee, the Indian rupee, used to be the currency. It used to be the currency in Oman. It used to be the currency in Qatar. It used to be the currency through much of the Gulf. If you go back to the 30s, right? And this is an advantage that, it was India after independence that stopped the Indian rupee from being the official currency of these countries in no sense, right? And we should, and I think we still have connections and an influence in Indonesia, in Thailand, in a bunch of places where throughout Africa, pretty well throughout Africa, that we do not make enough of. So I fully agree with you. I think we tend to be very not just North America. We tend to be very US centric in our focus, even of foreign policy. It, by the way, shows up even in how our Ministry of External Affairs operates. They are excessively US focused in their concerns, and not adequately concerned about the rest of the world. Other countries, Japan, etc., that are high in the scale, but the potential in South Korea, the potential in Indonesia, the potential in, before the coup anyway, in Myanmar, the potential in much of East Africa, in North Africa, in South Africa, in West Africa is huge. Yeah. I agree with you.
Bollywood. Sorry, go ahead.
And Bollywood, I agree, in all of these countries.
Okay, thank you.
I think Neeraj has a very interesting question, Farhad. For Farhad.
Yeah, actually, I'm not supposed to be, saying much here today, but to answer your question, Neeraj, a lot of what Naushad has written in the book has also appeared in various articles that he has published, and we have debated and discussed many of those articles at different times. I think there's a great degree of alignment in terms of views within the family as far as what Naushad has sort of written. And our daughter Ria actually spent a lot of time editing what Naushad has written as well.
Giving me feedback again and again.
And giving feedback, and also maybe toning down some of the language in certain cases as well, things like that. But otherwise, I would say that it was very much the views are very much representative of what we all believe and think. And in terms of how has it influenced or changed my own understanding of how Naushad thinks, I don't think it's changed anything really. And we look forward to his next book.
Yeah.
Thank you, Farhad. And we will ask Ria and Junior as well.
Correct.
You can ask that question to them too. Sure.
But did your dad read the book yet? Or have you discussed it with him? Or how is he?
You can answer that now, Sham.
No,
I
more
mean,
difficult.
I would say, we've talked about it, but it's he's now at a stage where it's a little difficult for him to read something like this. So he has a general idea of it. And to be very honest, I think the views which Naushad has expressed, a lot of that actually comes from what it comes from him, and something which both Naushad and I have learned from over the years.
And he writes very well too, or he wrote very well. No, thank you for it.
By the way, in terms of sort of Ria's comments on Ria's my niece, by the way. So Ria's comments on various drafts and so on, they were really incredibly helpful.
He's also a Stanford alum, let me remind you.
Yes, three times over. Yeah.
Naushad, I want to just pick on your role as an industrialist, and you talk about this, I think, in the chapter on citizenship. The role industry can play, and you say for India to lead, Indian industry must do much more. Working together with the state and NGOs, we can deliver on wider development objectives in a unique manner. It's a very interesting chapter where you weave in CSR and a lot of other things, and also so you hold the mirror to the industries and say how we can be ethical, etc. Things are changing a lot. I'm from the startup world, and there's so much disruption. Some good, some not so good. But in this kind of a dynamic situation, particularly, and given some of the other complexities that we talked about, some of the threats we perceive to India as a nation and the diversity and so on, what role are you satisfied with the role the industry is playing in the current scenario? And you mentioned some of the stuff, but in today's context, really, what do you think the industry can do and maybe hasn't done? And again, it's a closed door, so we can.
No. So it's. I mean, I think if you look at what industry, it's. I think every time I look at Indian industry, you'll see industrialists and companies that impress and that inspire, and you'll see an aggregate performance that you wish was better, right? So take, for example, the response to the pandemic, right? Yeah. I mean, so many Indian companies did such an incredible job, where in the West, I think companies waited for the state to come in and rescue them and pay their salary bills and all of that, right? In India, several companies went out of their way to provide food for people, to vaccinate the community, to fly in oxygen plants. We've had a remarkable effort with the Pune platform for COVID response that Sudhir Mehta has been running. I mean, this is all, this is Indian industry at its best, Yeah, this is Indian industry doing what it can do because it has implementation capability and management capability, and it's making up for the state and its gaps in a very concrete, tangible way. Now, what should we be doing much more? Okay, then you have many other inspiring examples. I mean, Rahul Bajaj is obviously an inspiration in his forthrightness, in how he would speak out. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw is an inspiration in her comments and her forthrightness. There are too few like them, right? And I believe that if 100 Indian industrialists were open in their comments on policies, where they talk about policies that they agree with and think are good, and they talk also about the ones which they think are wrong and which need to be done better. And I think if 100 did that, the issue would go away. I have somewhere in the book, I have a sentence, I think, that says, an industrialist criticizing the government should not make the headlines. That's my metric for an independent private sector.
Yeah, I think actually you also said in the book, Naushad, one line is, we do not help them by being poodles, that we need to criticize and have honest feedback,
Yeah.
I think there was one more. Okay, there's just a comment there. So Naushad, just last question from me. And this is something that we also discussed in the in-person event. How exactly do you then go about having some impact, in terms of what people in government, people not necessarily just in government, but people with influence, with power in this country? How do you go about, if not criticizing, but getting them to do the kind of things that could move this country forward in many of the ways that you mentioned? How do you do that? Because it's really not easy in this atmosphere to get that message across.
You try in different ways. The argument that I've always made within CI, for example, is that, look, the process of, for example, if you take economic reform as one broad topic, economic reform happens in a pretty sporadic, unsystematic way in the country, but it can happen, it has happened, and it keeps happening. So how do you enable it to happen more is the question. And at least what I've always advocated, I've said that, look, for economic reform to happen in the country, 3 stars need to line up. You need to have the right minister. You need to have the right secretary who knows the field and is going to make something happen. And you need to have the work that's in place and clarity on what needs to change. And I said that CI's job is to have that third piece available and ready and pre-cooked.
And the other 2 line up.
Right? So that then if you have a time when the stars line up and you get the right minister who wants to do something and you have a competent secretary, you're ready with everything that needs to be done, it'll happen. It's not a very systematic way in which you get economic reform to happen, but it works. So that's one answer to the question. The second answer is that, in strange sort of ways, some things improve simply as a result of shining a light on them. So some things improve if you simply call some things out, if you write about them, again, in a non-confrontational but transparent way, and you say, this is how it is. You first get a little bit of defensiveness, but then after that, people sort of say, okay, now we better do something about this. So I think it only helps to be clear in what one is actually advocating.
Okay. Well, thanks, Naushad. I think Farhad has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something, Hari, and ask Naushad to speak to it, because one example of what was done was, the whole, at the time when getting the GST passed and getting it actually implemented, Naushad was CII president at that time. And there was a huge amount of work which was done behind the scenes very quietly. So maybe Naushad, you want to just say, because that's a very good example of what can be done and how it actually can can actually affect policy change.
So, yeah, so first of all, we took a very strong pro-GST stand. And at that time, there were people in the government, including some prominent ministers, and in an even smaller group, I'll tell you who, who were actually anti-GST and had concerns about GST. Yeah, and said, listen, GST is unpopular with traders. Traders are very much a core part of the group that votes for the BJP. How can we disaffect this core voting group of the and support group of the BJP? So we took a very strong public pro-GST stand, that this is important for India. It will increase, it will be revenue generating over time. It will greatly ease the way in which business is done. It will formalize the economy, all of those things. Yeah. And we repeated and in any number of interviews and so on. And one of the people in the government who was pro-GST was the finance minister at the time, Arun Jaitley. And Arun Jaitley, in a discussion, he said, listen, we need the opposition on board. So he said, can you reach out to the opposition? So we interacted with the opposition. And I went and met at that time Manmohan Singh, and Manmohan Singh said, because at that time there were statements that were being made by the Congress about where they were critical of GST. And I knew that Manmohan Singh was in favor of it. So he says, no. He says, our objections are purely political. Yeah. So in an interview, I made the statement that, well, when they said, no, Congress is against it, I said their objections are purely political. Anyway, about a week or 10 days later, I was in a meeting with Anand Sharma, who at that time was the leader of the opposition in the Rajya Sabha. And normally he was always extremely friendly with me. And this time he seemed very sort of, there seemed to be some anger, and he was, so at some point in time he said, our oppositions are not purely political. We weren't even talking about GST at the time. And then we had this good discussion. And it became clear that the opposition was purely political. And then we went and met Rahul Gandhi and spoke about this as well, and so on. And the Congress, as you know, supported the GST at the end of the day. And their support for the GST was essential. I'm not saying they supported the GST because from CI we went and spoke to them about it, but I mean, I hope it helped. And we did this with various state governments as well. We did this, and especially opposition state governments. So.
I guess we should wrap up, but Naushad, I want to end by asking one last question, which ties into how we started talking about education. Amartya Sen has talked about the argumentative Indian, and we have sort of now come back to a stage where we don't argue, we just listen to our own voice. If you see the TV channels and so on, and you talk in your last chapter about culture in a big way and homogeneity versus heterogeneity, and we just don't seem to know how to coexist. Again, is there something we can do fundamentally with education that will change us and become, have advocacy and a respect for diversity? Maybe that we seem to have lost. Is there I mean, you majored in industrial engineering and history. Maybe that has something to do with you writing a chapter on culture. But how do we, both at school level and at higher ed, really reform this?
I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but I think if I had to, take a crack at it, I'd say I think actually greater investment in education in the humanities, social sciences, is something that needs to be much more widespread in our country. I think we are poorly served by many leaders being either engineers or management graduates. I don't have anything against engineers or management graduates. I mean, all of us in the family are engineers and management graduates. But but I think if you only have that, or dominantly have that, I think we're poorly served. I think you need great. We should have many of our leaders in industry, in politics, in various walks of life should have degrees in literature, in history, and anthropology, and sociology, and all the rest, in economics. So I think that would help, because I think it would lead to greater, intellectual awareness and intellectual respect in the country. I mean, maybe I'm dreaming, but I think it would help.
Absolutely. And I think we all need to take a book, literally a page out of Naushad's book, in terms of how to frame an argument with lovely cartoons and some nice quotes, which sort of tempers and keeps it issue-based and not gets it personal, which seems to have become the norm. So I think that's definitely one other takeaway for me from your book, Naushad, and I've started subscribing to some journals which I would never read. Give me the other perspective. But thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, Naushad, for doing this not once but twice with us, and Hari for really always doing the heavy lifting, showing the enthusiasm, and everybody who joined today. We have the recording, which we will share with the wider audience as well. And really, it seems like a heavy book, but like I said, it's peppered with some beautiful anecdotes and light-hearted cartoons and so on, and a very thoughtful book. So do read. And any last comments, Hari and Naushad, and then we can wrap up.
No, thanks, Paula. Naushad, you can have the last word. I'm very happy that you, as Paula said, that you agreed to do this twice. And yeah, I hope you do write another book at some point sooner rather than later. I think a lot of the ideas that you have will resonate with a lot of people in this country. So thanks again.
Thank you. Now, I'll just say thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Paula and Hari, for your really excellent questions and for putting everything together. Greatly appreciated. And it's always, I mean, you can't ask for a better audience than a Stanford audience.
Of course, we are not at all biased, but we'll take that.
Correct. None of us are. No, it's a completely objective statement.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay,
Naushad.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye.